We're very happy that you're here. And Julia Wittmayer, she has a background in social and cultural anthropology, studied at the Free University in Amsterdam, and also holds a PhD in social sciences from the Erasmus University, where she focused on transition management and action research and actor roles. And I guess a lot of that will also come back in the speech of today. And currently, she holds the position of assistant professor at the Erasmus School of Social, Behavioral and Sciences, and is a senior researcher and advisor at Drift in Rotterdam. As far as I understood, Julia is very active in various research projects and activities. Some of them might be known, such as Sonnet on energy transitions, which we saw a lot about. Also, Action is a current research project on citizen science and a lot more. But the rest I will leave to Julia herself, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mehmet. Share screen. So, yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very, very happy to be here. In this long line of very nice names of the sustainability transitions field. And I just want to also just share my, that I really like the work that Nest is doing, and I think it's very important to be continuing that. So thank you very much for making this possible in the field. And it's a resource, the videos are a resource not only for early career researchers, as I said earlier, to the team, but it's also, it's for me a resource to see what colleagues are on about. So I think it's really good. So just today I will be talking about action research in transitions. And I wanted to start just telling a bit about myself, because this topic has very much to do with how my kind of career, academic career has been developing. As Mehmet said, my focus of my PhD was very much on transition management, action research, and actor roles. I couldn't come up with a better title on how to combine these three, so I just took them all together in the title. And the PhD was very much trying to make sense of transitions on a local scale. So I started in 2010, I finished in 2016, and back then in 2010, transition management was just being, started to being scientifically written up. There was lots of experimentation with it. Transition thinking was much about sectors, especially the energy sector and mobility. But there's the whole idea of that you could look at it at cities on a neighborhood level. That's all something that was just coming up. So that was one focus of my PhD research. And it was really also trying to develop transition management as a governance approach to local transitions, but also very much as an action research approach. So how could you think about kind of the changing roles and relations as part of what needs to change when you think about transitions? In the local, on the local level, but also within the scientific systems. And this question complex has been with me ever since. Some of the projects that Martel mentioned, I will also just mention. There's been one on transformative social innovation theory, really much looking at these changing roles and relations of actors that is part of sustainability transitions, and under the concept of social innovation. And from there, taking this up specifically in the energy sector, and there's a couple of these projects that I've been working on over the last years, and are just about to be finishing as well during the next half year, where we took it mainly to the energy sector. But my passion in all these research projects has been to find research formats that brings together communities, local policymakers and researchers to co-create knowledge together. And that has been part of my PhD research, but also has been always kind of with me ever since. And it has become the title of action research. And another thing I want to share just up front is that I think that research is really, or I consider it really as a craft. So it's something that you need to learn while doing it. It's not something you open your brain, you put on all these nice papers, and then you can do it. It's something you refine while doing it. And so it's some kind of an ongoing process of trial and error, and you refine the understanding of what it is that you're actually doing and the outcomes that you might yield with it. And of course, you should kind of stand on the shoulders of giants. You watch over their shoulders, but it's really through kind of engaging in action, in actually doing research, that you develop a refined understanding of what it is that you're doing and how it could change the settings within which you do this research. And this is actually for me the essence of action research, not only in the science system, but also when you apply it in other domains. It's through engaging in action and actually trying to change it that you get a better understanding. So in this way, let me start with a kind of a first tweaking of the title of my talk. I want to start off with rather talking about action-oriented research for and or of transitions. And action-oriented research is kind of the most uncomplicated and also most kind of accepted way to talk about this kind of research that has kind of different epistemologies and therefore is not always as accepted within our academic institutions. So staying with the practice, I want to kind of dive right into it with you and share two actual practices of where I did action research. Before I want to take a step back, come up with a bit more theory and kind of the principles underlying it, and then focus on two challenges before I close the talk. Okay, so let me take you back in time about a decade. So this is really my PhD research, and to the south of Rotterdam. That's a region in a city that is considered to be socially and economically deprived. And that for years already where kind of many national but also local, so city programs have been trying to alleviate or bring alleviation to this inequality, but that kind of never really got onto it. And I specifically went to the neighborhood or worked in a neighborhood that's in blue there. It's Canesse, and there's about 10,000 inhabitants living there from many different backgrounds. In the action research I engaged in started in September 2010 and went on until about June 2015 with different stages. And I've been doing that with a number of colleagues. I haven't done this on my own. And the timing was really, so 2010, for those who remember, right in the aftermath of the global economic crisis. When there was a lot of discourses around participation society, it was called in the Netherlands, or big society in the UK. So citizens were supposed to take on more active roles and becoming more active in the public sector because governments were kind of rescuing banks, to put it a bit black and white, and didn't have money for a lot of the social services, were kind of withdrawing. So there was this idea of a withdrawing welfare state. And that hit also very much in this neighborhood, where the community center, for example, was being closed and many of the welfare services were being discarded. And what we did there were two things. So the city funded parts of the research, as did the European Union. For them, the question was really about, okay, how could we frame the problems that we see in this neighborhood? How can we find a direction towards this neighborhood becoming more just and sustainable, and how we can get into action? So these were the kind of the questions that the city had. How can we get out of this image of these neighborhoods being socially and economically deprived, and also do something about this deprivation? And the research was, as I just said, it was really about trying to find out whether with this kind of action-oriented research we could make a difference, and also influence the kind of how transitions are governed on a local level. And this is a really full slide, I know. What it basically wants to show is that we did a whole process, and we took these transition management principles, some of you might know them, to design this action-oriented research process over 5+1 stages. And what we actually engaged in was, we're doing loads of interviews. We were doing loads of document reviews to understand what was going on. We were as inspired by the anthropological background that I have, wandering around in the neighborhood, talking to people, really kind of getting to the grounding of, okay, what it is that's happening here and who sees it in which ways. And from there, we started to invite people that are considered frontrunners in the transition management approach, but which is a very difficult concept to operationalize on such a local level. But we organized these change agents together in a group that was thinking about, okay, how can we look at the framing that we were proposing on the basis of the analysis that we did, How does this correspond to their framings? What's actually problematic, and how can we do something about it? Where does this neighborhood want to go? We did backcasting sessions to think about, okay, what are the pathways that this neighborhood could follow? And that was really one stream of our work. And then the second stream of our work that was in parallel was really focusing on the experimentation and implementation. So it was really focusing on how the closed community center that I just talked about, how can this be reopened in a self-organized way? So there were a body of, or a number of people that were really concerned about this closure of this very community center, and were looking into ways on how to reopen it, and also actually reopening it. And the same went on with a garden that was also serving educational purposes. So the outcomes of this process were very diverse. You can think about individual people and their learnings. You can also think about how people got connected in different ways. You could take the blooming Canista, so the blossoming Canista, the narrative of the neighborhood, how it could look in the future. You look at all the events that we did and how it kind of also broadcasted the image that the people living in the neighborhood have, that it is not as bad as or framed in a way that policy would like to believe. There's a reopened community center. The community garden was open for quite a while. It closed around 2016, if I remember correctly. And we had a range of presentations at scientific conferences. We had scientific articles, and we had 3 PhD theses that were connected to this period. But this was the first example, and it was really kind of a long-term engagement. A second example is taking you kind of moving fast forward in time to like last year and this year, and to the city of Antwerp in Belgium. And as part of the Sonnet project, we are working, and still do, with 6 cities in city labs, that's how it's called, on specific challenges that they are experiencing. And they experience them in relation to how they want to move forward the energy transitions and the decarbonizations of their cities. And we are specifically adrift working with Antwerp, who want to address the issue of energy poverty. So we engaged with them from beginning of last year until about July in this very process. And Antwerp wanted to, basically what they did is a city lab process that included the city administration, us as Research Institute, and another consulting. And we were together helping to look at 4 experiments that were being selected and being also initiated, that were trying to address this energy poverty more specifically or more practically. And they were supported by the city of Antwerp and the consultants that were in this kind of city lab team. And the role of Drift was really to support them through using a reflexive monitoring in action approach. That's the picture of the report that you see here. It's a really nice method to help to draw out lessons. So you basically start with the learning questions that you have for such a process. So for example, for that city lab process, the questions of the city of Antwerp were being elicited. And from there, we're having kind of learning session and field diaries to help them reflect and integrate that reflection in how they adapted the approach that they were taking. Also here, outcomes were the insights for the individuals involved, for the city that are being embedded in the structures there, a comparative report with the insights, and scientific papers are not done there yet. They're hopefully to be coming. And before I go on, I thought I'm going to ask you to think a bit with me. Having heard that, what is it for you that's action-oriented or transformative about such a research approach? And when would such a research approach be needed? So I thought I'd just give you a minute to think about that. And it's not so much that I'm going to have a big discussion, but I want you to think along and think about, okay, what do you think is now here really action-oriented or transformative about, so that we can take that up later during the discussion. Okay. Because I'm going to make a big jump now from these very, very concrete practices to some basic assumptions about the world and science. Because one of the things that in the kind of ideal, typical descriptions of these kind of action-oriented or action research approaches happens is that they try to solve problems of the world. And then they do that through very small projects. And that's one of the things that we always should keep in mind. Okay, so I'm going to just take a step back from practice and go with you into the more theoretical and the kind of epistemological underpinnings of this kind of research. Where does it come from? Why is it necessary? So what we can say is that the shared focus of sustainability transition studies and also other studies that focus on transformations or transitions is a focus on a specific kind of societal problem, and that's so-called persistent or wicked problems. And these are problems, and I think I will say it, most of you will know it, but it's problems which are complex because they have kind of multiple causes and consequences. They're uncertain in that possible solutions change the perception of the problem, but also this uncertainty can often not be reduced by more knowledge. They're difficult to manage because of the high number of actors that are being involved and interacting, and that also these actors not always agree on kind of the values and the facts that are being involved or discussed. They are hard to grasp as well, since also it's unclear how to structure these. So which is your angle onto these problems? And they're often deeply rooted in current structures and institutions. So such kind of unstructured questions, they pose a problem to how we generate knowledge, or at least a challenge, because what they requires, or what they do is they ask for this integration of natural and social sciences. They cannot be entirely investigated from one scientific discipline, and they cannot be investigated by science alone, because there's the whole value judgments, the orientation coming in. Where to, what do we want to, if we consider this a problem, this is already a normative statement, but also in which direction do we want it to be solved? So what are possible solutions? And it has also of course to do with how the public perceives science and what the role of science is. So what they require is kind of really a systems perspective. So we can look at the interrelations and interdependencies of the different elements of such a problem. They are aimed at a kind of also such a system analysis, systems perspective is also aimed at, if you look at how these problems are being produced and reproduced, also kind of trying to deconstruct really how this is happening. How is the problem being kept in place, and looking at the underlying problems of that. What they need is pluralism, so in terms of the inter and the transdisciplinarity, but also there's not one method that actually can get the insights across for such a problem. And of course, we need this collaboration across disciplines. And nothing of that is really new, because such research approaches stand in kind of a longer tradition. So research approaches that really try to pick up on such issues, and they come in different disguises, and might talk about them as a kind of a loose movement that tries to integrate more science and society in order to address specific problems. So you have, for example, in the 1930s, the more actual research approaches that are really connected to also questions of emancipation. You have in the 1970s science technology studies really involving society in technology development after it has become clear that technological development has a lot of kind of side effects or unintended consequences. Then the whole turn toward making science more applicable to complex societal issues with Mode 2 post-normal sciences, transdisciplinary science. That's also when kind of sustainability science started up. And then you see the kind of last wave, and we have taken the waves to depict that with a colleague, because action research is still there, right? And also STS studies is still there. It's kind of subsuming into these waves. And the last wave, you see loads of different terms there. It's because we're right into it, and it's really difficult to see how these analyze it. And that's why I thought for the last wave, I'd just give some very concrete examples. There's the work by Ian Facey. What he's talking about is second-order transformation research. So he really considers science as an intervention, as being action-oriented, and gives kind of 10 different principles for that. There's the work by Nordstrom and colleagues, which I think is really interesting because they make it really succinct and to the point, which they need to do for nature sustainability. And there are 4 principles along which they talk about knowledge co-production. So again, another term. And there's new work in action research that really pulls together action research and transformations. So the action research for transformations or art movement. And also within sustainability transition studies, I did a quick check in Scopus. The topic of action research is coming up more prominently. And it also includes the formulation of transformative research as a kind of one of those action-oriented collaborative research approaches next to more descriptive analytical ones that addresses kind of how to, not only what are transformations, but also how to change the way things are going. And I would like to continue on this notion of transformative research because we are currently developing this with a colleague, Christina, who's also in the audience. And what we mean by this, and it's trying to pull this all together, is that it's research that addresses these persistent societal problems to foster the sustainability transitions, so really having this direction. This kind of research takes a more critical standpoint because it tries to transform the dominant ways of how things are done, so the regime, if you like. And it works in collaboration with people from different scientific disciplines, but also from societal domains. And it does so in systematic settings. So in ways that are being structured so that they can also be serving in ways to add to scientific knowledge. So there's then a third tweaking or second tweaking of the title of my talk. You could think about transformative research. And I did that because I wanted to also share that during the last 10 years, there has been loads happening on this front. And there's many different terms being used. And it's really already trying to understand which term to be using and in which tradition to be working. And it can be quite a challenge. Also for me, it has been an ongoing kind of refining of my understanding of what it is that I'm doing, as I said at the start. So just turning to these principles of transformative research, I already introduced 3 of them. So the more systemic understanding, the systemic perspective, the kind of deconstruction we need to do through such a systemic perspective to get towards the underlying problems and not only see the symptoms. The methodological pluralism, but also the pluralism in terms of understandings that we need to take into account, and the collaborative nature of it. And that kind of comes from this focus on persistent problems. But there's also this focus of such research that aims to transform the status quo, and that's to be kind of generative of new ways of doing thinking and organizing different systems, such as the water system or the energy. So it's not only kind of oriented at deconstructing what is there, but also to find new ways to construct. And Flora Avelino and John Bryn have termed this reconstruction. I think it's a very nice article where they come up with very nice work on how to think about not only what it should be, but what also can be. And that's their focus in terms of reconstruction. And that's reconstructing new meanings and narratives, and through that already being practical. But also new actions, experiments, you name it. The second one is that it's reflexive, in that it acknowledges not only that we as researchers are part of the system, so we're not something or somebody looking from the outside onto what we are studying, we are part of the thing we're studying, and which we are analyzing. And the research that we do basically interacts with and also kind of affects the institutional settings in which we are operating. So the idea that this action research is not only kind of optimizing what's there, but really addressing these underlying problems. And it does this through iterations. So basically it's a process, as you see on the Canessa example that I shared as the first one. It's really a longer process. It's really dynamic, and we work in collaborations, so which all involved also learning new ways of how to, for example, keep such a community center open. And there's many challenges of doing such research, and I will just share a number of them. There's these epistemological challenges, basically how do we know, right? And integrating different kinds of knowledges from these different disciplines. Can they actually be integrated, or do they more live next to each other? But also integrating different thought styles of practitioners and researchers thinking in really different, or can be thinking in different ways. You need to be explaining, one of the challenges is that you need to be explaining why it's important to take, for example, embodied knowledge into account when you talk to, scientists, let's put it a bit anonymous, but also to basically say that to address with this kind of research how society sees research. For them, research is often, okay, you go do, for social science, you do interviews, you do document reviews, you come back, you have a report, and that's your recommendations. Doing this kind of more embedded research or collaborative research also necessitates explanation of what it is and why this is research to a societal audience. And that's something I have experienced quite often. There's methodological challenges. There can be really meta about who actually owns this problem that you're working on. So whose problem is it that this neighborhood is as kind of signs of economically and social deprivation? About another challenge is the positionality of the researcher. Who are you? White. I was young back then. German person doing research in a Dutch context, for example. But also other challenges are about developing appropriate research methods that are both kind of living up to scientific standards, but also respect the work that you're doing with stakeholders, and the trainings that are often not available for these kind of methods. Then there are personal, social, and political challenges. They relate to, again, personality, but also dealing with conflicting roles, and I will go in more detail about that. And they can also be political in terms of the legitimacy that you have to actually intervene in such problems. Who are you as a researcher to, or are you as part of your institution to actually do these kind of interventions and kind of try to enact change? And the last challenge is related to the way we work in our institutions, in our academic structures, often focused on age indexes, on more working within specific disciplines, which is all really challenged by working in practice, because a problem in practices cannot be divided by disciplines, right? So you need to be, even when you are vested within a specific discipline, you need to be able to work together, because you need this holistic take onto a problem. Otherwise, you and the practitioner will not come together. But that makes your career prospects worse. So I know PhD students I've been talking to really, okay, but I need to do it in economics. That's where the chair is. That's where I need to publish in these journals. And this kind of research can be really difficult to be published in journals that are considered excellent by specific disciplines. There's, of course, recognition and reward systems that are not tied into how societal engagement can also be enriching, and how it can add to kind of the third missions that many universities have. So from the more kind of overview, I go now into 3 challenges, one of which is an ongoing one. And I will do so again, taking you back in time to 2010, and from there, just telling these 3 challenges that I picked and that I have been doing some work on. So one of these personal challenges was really the role of researchers. And so this is the slide I showed earlier. So that example was really part of my PhD research, and I saw many of these problems. And then we had this one conference, my first scientific conference. I gave this presentation about our work, and basically the result, the remarks I got was a bit something along these lines, that if you are actually engaged in this research, you are taking on a double role, yeah, right? You're an activist and a researcher, and this obscures your analysis. So you cannot really realistically analyze this process. So it was really kind of, you're modeling with your data. I always kind of take that as an acronym for that claim. On the other hand, was this really actual research we did? Did we really involve everybody in the research problem description, in describing a research question? Did we emancipate them through providing them with the methods to do the research themselves? So did we really immerse to that extent that we try to change the system so that we can understand it better? So there's this different kind of norms that you are thought to live up to that come from different understandings of how research is done or should be done in its ideal types. And I was really confused because what it is, okay, who am I? What am I supposed to do? And you know, if so, how many? I haven't never read the book, but I like the title because it basically made me rethink of who one is as a researcher. And I did that work together with a colleague, Nico Schepke, trying to make sense of these different roles that you have when you engage in more action-oriented, collaborative or transdisciplinary research, by pulling together work that others have been doing on that, and by looking at the work that we have been doing in the CANESA project. So I just share these roles that we have been coming up with, and it's really kind of a heuristic for us to be able to talk with each other, to give us a language about such research and what it requires. So there's a reflective scientist, which is kind of closest to what's conventionally being understood as a researcher. You know, you interview, you analyze data, you write articles. There's a process facilitator. You actually stand in front of the meetings, you facilitate them. You need to see whom to give a voice when. Then you are a knowledge broker. So there's you mediate between different perspectives that are in a room, but that are also on paper. So with articles, so the paper authors being present in your head as well. You are a change agent because you're kind of part of actions and you support others in doing them. So for example, for this opening of the community center, I've been talking to I have been calling lawyers on the phone to understand like what would be the legal consequences of reopening the center, for example. So really getting into the mud of trying to understand what it is and how this could be changed. And being self-reflexive. So being self-reflexive about who you are within that system, your role, but also reflexive about what makes the system being stuck in the context that it is and what can you do in order to change the institutional setting. And that's this role we haven't discussed in the paper, but which I think is really, really important, is the project manager. Because what it does, it frames all the other roles in a sense, because in the way that you have to, as a project manager, have to defend your project vis-a-vis a research funding institution, for example, really makes or breaks the space that you have for all the other roles. Also, you know, the budget and all the other discussions. So how to go about these roles? The visualization on the left-hand side is made by Paul and colleagues, and maybe I'm not sure whether you can really see it, but the most important thing to take away is that it shows the intensity of collaboration between disciplines. That's the blue line, and between within external stakeholders. That's the green line. And what it does, and that's what I think also in relation to the roles is important. When you think about your roles that you take in these kind of processes, it's thinking about, okay, over time, I take on different roles and I take them with different intensities, right? There's these moments when I have these really co-production moments, you know, it's in step, very beginning, when the green goes really up, that's when you're likely to be a facilitator, the knowledge broker, that's when that comes. When this line goes really down, this is where you're more likely going to analyze your interviews, analyze the outcomes of that session, and so on and so forth. So there's different moments in time when you are doing different kinds of roles or taking on different kinds of roles. But also, there's no requirement for you taking on all those roles, right? Work in a team. And then you can take on those roles that you also feel more comfortable with, that you have skills and expertise in. Then these are ideal types, the roles, so you're never going to see them so black and white. You see them also being in conflict with each other or kind of being modeled in practice. So this is what I wanted to say about roles before I move on to the next challenge. And that's really one about collaborative processes. And that's kind of the processes within which this role understanding comes to bear. And here I would like to go to how the kind of relation between science and society has been conceptualized and how has been thought about that. And many of these more action-oriented approaches, including this kind of transformative research, what they have in common is that they're process-oriented. And Miller has been writing really nicely about that, about knowledge-first approaches and process-oriented approaches in sustainability science, putting much of kind of transition management ideas, the action-oriented research approaches into these process-oriented research approaches. What they basically do is they have kind of this overlapping idea where science and society overlap, and that's kind of where there's this space for collaboration and for joint knowledge production, also referred to as agora by two scholars. It's kind of the space where public and science meets. And it's in these spaces when roles and relations often get blurred and pluralized. And there is when a number of questions arose for me. Because in relation to the people that we're working with, there's the question, how do you relate to them? Is it about creating a trustful relationship? But what then is trustful, respectful? And what about the space that you need in order to voice this critique that you have, that you take from the system's perspective and all the knowledge and research that you have been reading up onto specific problems? And that's kind of when emerged, and I formulated that in the methodological school, if you have been part of that one this year, a paradox that reads as one needs to be both engaged, so being in relation with, but also detached, so critical, to understand and address wicked problems. And we have been, together with colleagues, putting that into a definition for actual research, because we think that's when actual research can be really generative. It's when it's a critical and relational process where researchers and co-inquiries come together to produce both scientifically and socially relevant knowledge, but also transformative action. So this is about really being this critical about how society is structured currently, based on systems analysis, on interviews, on co-production sessions, and what needs to be required to transform these systems, to become more just and more sustainable, for example, but also building these respectful relationships and recognizing that through such relationships, such critique might land in a better listening ear. And that's kind of the focus of this book that we have been editing in 2018, where we have, that's an overview of the different approaches to research, to action research in this book, just to show that also action research as such is like full of different ways on how it can be approached and how it can be also implemented. The most common one, often referred to as being participatory action research, which really focuses on more institutionalized but also kind of sustained inequalities in society. And each of these approaches, we have been asking the authors to come up with a kind of a heuristic for how they navigate this tension of being critical and relational. And what they came up with is some of them I show here. So really this creation and cultivating of sanctions. So, making space for and being sanctioned to do it. So it's really always putting forth and then waiting, and then, okay, now it's good enough to be done. The more soft resistance is like always giving these little pushes. So they have all done these relation in very different ways. But what they have all been doing now, all been using, is the kind of process perspective. So it's not a one-off thing. You don't do an interview and go away again, but you see these people again and again and again. And that makes that you can cultivate both being critical and being relational. Of course, many of you might be interested in what putting lipstick on a pig means, and I really like, at least I like the quote a lot. And this is a very self-reflexive critique on her own action research, basically. She says, rather than being transformative or being at least changing, it felt much more like putting lipstick on a pig. And I think that's also one of those dilemmas in doing action research. On the one hand, it is still a research approach that needs legitimacy. So you want to show it's working because you think it works and you see that it works, but it works on such a small scale that you can wonder, how transformative is it in the end? And then it can at times really feel as putting lipstick on a pig. And that's the last institutional challenge, and it's also the outlook, so it's kind of my summary as well, that I'm currently working on. It's the challenge of institutionalizing transformative research approaches. And to this end, we have been looking at transformative research as a social innovation. And as I showed you at the start, I had always have this focus on social relations and social roles, and we have used social innovation as a concept, and the more the focus on science. Now I try to bring this together to show you the involvement in my thoughts and how that worked out. So transformative research really as an innovation in the science system, and building on the work on transformative social innovation theory that we have been doing. Transformative research really has these configurations of ideas, actions, or objects that change social relations, so between, for example, researchers and societal partners, involving new ways of doing thinking and or organizing research. And that can be transformative to the extent that it challenges, alters, and replaces existing institutions. So what I'm proposing to be doing is to do transformative research within the academic system in order to kind of challenge, alter, and hopefully replace some of the existing institutions, like age indexes and stuff. And there are organizations, so institutionalization is ongoing. There are organizations that make space for such research. There's the Fana University in Germany, really focus on that as a whole university, but also departments of, for example, the Humboldt University, Stockholm Resilience Institute, DRIFT, for example. There's many others. I put those four because we're collaborating in a postdoc program on transformational leadership with each other. But of course, also there's always this question that you can be wondering about how much of that is kind of putting lipstick on a pig. So in how far are these institutions really taking up action research or action-oriented research approaches as part of how their institutions work, and how much do they make actually institutional space, or do they just put it into, like DRIFT? DRIFT is a company at the Erasmus University, right? We're kind of put it into a certain topic and it doesn't threat the faculties yet, let's say yet. Because what we want to do, what we basically are doing currently is that basically Thursday, we're launching the Design, Impact, and Transition platform at the Erasmus University, and the idea is really that this to be this action research experiment that allows us to make space within our institutions, so within the Erasmus University, to change the institutional setup so that there is more space for transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary research. And one way that this platform is trying to do that, and this platform maybe as a background, because it might be playing in many of your universities as well, there's the whole idea of the third mission of the universities, right? That they have a societal goal that they also need to serve. And at the Erasmus University, this has been formulated as creating positive societal impact. And as part of the university strategy, there was kind of money to set up this DIT platform, and we're really happy that it gives us this space to provide ecosystems basically for researchers who want to do it differently, who want to do different education, so who want to do different research, but also different ways of engaging, and we call these academic ecosystems, to give it a nice word. And so the next years, we'll be looking into kind of positioning, transformative research, but also education engagement, setting up communities of practice to learn with and from each other, because as I said, from my understanding of research as a craft, it's very much about talking with each other and learning from each other. How have you been doing this? How have you been dealing with this? What is about this ethical dilemma? How do you work around this? And I've been setting up such practices more in the interpretive policy analysis field rather than in the sustainability transitions field, but I hope we can also move it much more there. I think I leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention. And maybe I can take some of you along in this institutionalization challenge. Yeah, looking forward to your questions.